please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
What was being feared for many months has finally become a reality. The tariff war has indeed kicked off. US's tariffs on Chinese products worth $34 billion came into effect today. Beijing immediately retaliated, imposing higher tariffs on US goods worth $34 billion. But the war doesn't end here. US President Donald Trump has announced that tariffs on additional $16 billion worth of Chinese goods are set to take effect in 2 weeks. That's not all. The hostilities could intensify further as Trump has threatened to impose higher tariffs on Chinese goods worth $500 billion if Beijing continues to retaliate and not yield to the US's demands. How will this spiraling dispute between the two countries impact other countries like India? Joining us now to discuss this further is Song Zhang, Washington Bureau Chief of Venhu Daily, and Harsh Pant of the Observer Research Foundation. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here. Harsh, let me start by asking you, what do you make of what we've now seen is the start of the trade war? So far, most people have been hoping that both China and the US would pull back, that a middle ground would be arrived at. But now that doesn't seem like a possibility. It now does seem like both sides are all in.
Yes, I think it's quite likely now that this will escalate because the Chinese have already retaliated, and I think the next level of retaliation from Mr. Trump is going to be there, as he has indicated in a rally. He, in fact, intends to take it up all the way to $500 billion worth of trade. So I think there is a larger dynamic being played here where his concerns, or at least the Trump administration's concerns about intellectual property, about the bilateral surplus growing vis-a-vis China. I think all of them have coalesced into this major argument that politically for him it's unsustainable if he does not take these decisions. So I think the politics and economics of this for Mr. Trump makes sense. It may not make sense for the rest of the world. And I think now that the Chinese have retaliated, we are all waiting to hear 16 weeks down the line what Mr. Trump does. So I think we are on an escalation ladder, and I think all the countries around the world had hoped in the past that this would not come to this. It had come to this. I think everyone is hoping now that it would not escalate. But I think it's very unlikely in the short term that this would find a modus. The two sides would find a modus vivendi. So I'm very doubtful if we can contain that over the next 16 or 15 weeks that we have for the next round of retaliation.
When would you agree with that assessment that that it's unlikely that we are now going to see a pullback from where we stand today, and this is now going to spiral into more escalation?
I agree with another panelist, and actually we know that in the last couple of months, China and America have been engaged in bilateral trade negotiations for 2, 3, 4 times, but it failed, and the Chinese believed that Mr. Trump is not predictable. And last time in May, Vice Premier Liu He from China was in D.C. I was over there, and there were a lot of discussions and finally reconciliations. But immediately when Mr. Liu He returned back to Beijing, Mr. Trump seems to have changed his mind. And I think now China believed only after a few rounds of tariff and retaliation from each other, and maybe the opportunity will only come for negotiations. And we hear that Chinese Vice President Wang Qishan was planning to visit Washington, D.C. By the end of last month, but he didn't go. That shows that China is not believing his visit may have to seal any kind of understanding. So maybe after only a couple of weeks later, when the two countries realize that they will be both damaged, so maybe the real opportunity will only come.
Okay, well, currently that doesn't seem to be the possibility of a pullback. But Harsh, let me ask you this. You know, we've already seen China moving on things like soybean, which hurts Trump country, essentially. What do you believe are now the points of leverage that the US may want to exercise and China would like to exercise as well?
Well, I think the larger issue that both the US and China face is that who is going to hurt more. And in that context, the Chinese have actually leveraged their first round of retaliation pretty effectively by targeting commodities like soya or the pork, etc., which actually are targeted the Rust Belt, which is the sort of heartland of Mr. Trump and where he gets most of his votes. So in that sense, the argument from the Chinese side seems to be that if they can increase the threshold of pain for Mr. Trump politically, only then will he realize that somehow he needs to take a break and he needs to back down. So I think there they have targeted and they've tried to leverage that aspect very categorically. The other, I think, what we have seen from the American side is largely the argument that, look, the relationship is so big that and the threshold of pain for the Chinese side, given that China already faces economic negative headwinds, potentially can make a case to the Chinese that, look, if you do not take our concerns seriously, then perhaps greater damage may come. And that is the message that the Americans have been trying to send. I think the larger reality seems to be that the Chinese are reading it more to the political economy angle, where the argument seems to be that ultimately this is about slowing down China, which is largely a political argument that you want to make China subservient to America. And this is something that you hear from the Chinese analysts. And therefore, for Mr. Xi Jinping, backing down is not an option. So he will stand up as resolutely as possible. Perhaps after the next round of retaliation, there can be some sort of an agreement between the two, where they try to try to save the face.
If backing down, as Harsh is pointing out, is not an option as far as Xi Jinping is concerned, what can we then expect also by way of non-tariff intervention on the part of China?
Obviously has less leverage upon US, I think, because we are exporting much less. We are exporting much more than US on trade. So, but China has many other options, including this currency issue and also the very huge fund we are buying from America. But those options, in my opinion, are all bad options. It is bad for China, it is worse. It is bad for America, it is also very bad for China. So, but China cannot pull back at this moment. So China has to go ahead, and China has to encourage many other countries, including India, European countries, Japan, because they are having same difficulty from the United States. So I think after a few rounds of retaliations, and US will face different challenges from different countries. So then maybe the real chance will come.
How likely is it, Harsh, and I'll end with that question, that this will in fact bring India and China closer together?
Yes, we have already seen China and India. We are engaging high-level kind of discussions on trade, and even China is trying to lower tariffs of the soybean and other agricultural products from India, and we are trying to also push forward this RCEP, that is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, to the end. And we can finally achieve that within this year. And I think China and India will benefit from this kind of bilateral cooperation and multilateral cooperations in this process.
Okay. Harsh, a quick word from you on that before we close.
Well, I think we have seen how Mr. Modi's reset with the Chinese leadership has started, and I think it largely started because the recognition that the headwinds that we are facing from Mr. Trump, it can be very unpredictable and can take us into territory that we have not experienced for the last 2 decades. So I think both China and India have a singular agenda at this point to somehow manage this transition and manage this unpredictability, and I think both will find much that can be gained by working together.
All right, Harsh and Ben, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate you joining us here to decode the latest in the battle between the US and China on the trade front. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us here.